Yamamoto cancelled a scheduled bombardment of Midway by Admiral Kurita's 4 heavy cruisers. 2 of these, Mikuma and Mogami, which had sunk Houston and Perth in the Java Sea, were attacked by the bombers Captain Simard had left on Midway, 6 Dauntless dive bombers and 6 old Marine Corps Vindicators. Both cruisers were damaged, and Mikuma next day was sunk by dive bombers from Hornet. By 10 a.m. June, 5 Spruance's carriers were about 50 miles north of Midway. 5 hours later, they launched 58 Dauntless dive bombers to search for targets, but found only 1 destroyer. After continuing to a point some 400 miles west of Midway and increasing his score only by the sinking of Mikuma, Spruance turned east on the evening of the 6th to keep a fueling rendezvous. After the battle was over, Yamamoto blamed his defeat on the failure of his advance screen of 16 submarines to accomplish anything. The fault, however, was the admiral's. He had deployed them to catch the Pacific Fleet where he counted on its being, instead of where it was. Nevertheless, a Parthian shot by one of these boats scored for Japan in the last play of this big game. Her victim was Yorktown, abandoned after her hits on 4 June unnecessarily, as proved by the fact that she floated for 24 hours with no human hand to help. She was taken in tow on the 5th by minesweeper Vireo, too small to cope with the carrier's 19,800-ton bulk. As Yorktown inched along toward home on 6 June, submarine On-168 penetrated her destroyer screen and got 2 torpedoes home. A 3rd torpedo sank destroyer Hammond, which was then alongside the carrier to furnish power and pumps for her salvage crew. She went down in 4 minutes, taking 81 officers and men with her. The 2 other torpedo hits finished old waltzing Matilda. During the night her list suddenly increased, and at dawn it was evident she was doomed. The escorting destroyers half-masted their colours, all hands came to attention, and at 6 a.m., with her loose gear making a horrible death rattle, Yorktown rolled over and sank in a 2,000-fathom deep. Midway was a victory not only of courage, determination, and excellent bombing technique, but of intelligence, bravely and wisely applied. Had we lacked early information of the Japanese movements, and had we been caught with carrier forces dispersed, the Battle of Midway would have ended differently, commented Admiral Nimitz. So, too, it might have ended differently but for the chance which gave Spruance command over 2 of the 3 flat tops. Fletcher did well, but Spruance's performance was superb. Calm, collected, decisive, yet receptive to advice. Keeping in his mind the picture of widely disparate forces, yet boldly seizing every opening, Raymond A. Spruance emerged from this battle one of the greatest admirals in American naval history. The Japanese knew very well that they were beaten. Midway thrust the warlords back on their heels, caused their ambitious plans for the conquest of Port Moresby, Fiji, New Caledonia and Samoa to be cancelled, and forced on them an unexpected and unwelcome defensive role. The word went out from Imperial headquarters that the name Midway was not to be mentioned. Admirals Nimitz, Fletcher and Spruance are, as I write, very much alive. Captain Mitcher of Hornet, Captain Murray of Enterprise and Captain Miles Browning of the Slide Rule Mind have joined the 60 young aviators who met flaming death that day in reversing the verdict of battle. Think of them, reader, every 4th of June. They and their comrades who survived changed the whole course of the Pacific War. The Guadalcanal campaign, the most bitterly contested in American history since the campaign of Northern Virginia in the Civil War, comprised 7 major naval engagements, at least 10 pitched land battles, and innumerable forays, bombardments and skirmishes. It began as a gleam in Admiral King's eye in early February 1942. He saw clearly that the Japanese must not be permitted to consolidate the formidable prizes that they were then in the course of gathering. To the basic pre-war strategic decision to beat Germany first, King always remained faithful, but he insisted that it would be fatal to adopt a purely defensive attitude in the Pacific, as General Sir Alan Brooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, and other British strategists demanded. Limited offensives against the Japanese must be begun, and bases secured by us for future advances. Otherwise, the Japanese would certainly advance from Rabaul in the Bismarck Archipelago into Papua and New Guinea, then into Australia, Samoa, and even New Caledonia. The Joint Chiefs of Staff did not take kindly to the Admiral's defensive-offensive strategy, as he called it. They regarded it as a diversion. They were trying to block Churchill's diversion of our build-up for the main attack on Germany into North Africa. Wasn't this the same sort of thing in the Pacific? King vigorously denied it. The Bismarck archipelago, he pointed out, blocks a main road. General MacArthur would say the only road to Tokyo and Guadalcanal is the toll gate. If we don't pay the toll, the Japanese will, and sail through in the contrary direction to Noumea, Fiji and Queensland. On 3 May, as we have seen, the Japanese seized Tulagi, opposite Guadalcanal. Washington countered by allowing Vice Admiral Robert L. Gormley, recently appointed Commander South Pacific Force, to move into Espiritu Santo and start a base there, 28 May. The Free French had already allowed us to use Noumea. Japan's defeat at Midway caused General Tojo to shift his attention once more to the Southwest Pacific. A new 8th Fleet under Vice Admiral Mikawa was created to spearhead a fresh advance from Rabaul. New airfields were built at Rabaul to accommodate an air flotilla, and troops were alerted to march on Port Moresby, Papua, across the Owen Stanley Mountains. In order to enable land-based bombers to cover this advance, more airfields would have to be constructed in the Solomons. Tulagi was fit only for a seaplane base. Admiral King, with this intelligence in hand, overcame General Marshall's objections and obtained a Joint Chiefs of Staff directive on 2 July 1942 for Operation Watchtower. The South Pacific Force would first seize Tulagi and Guadalcanal. General MacArthur, in command of Southwest Pacific Forces and area at Brisbane, would then assume responsibility for taking the rest of the Solomons and finally Rabaul. That would remove one major barrier, the Bismarck archipelago, to the recovery of the Philippines and the defeat of Japan. On 5 July, South Pacific reconnaissance planes gathered a bit of news that sparked off Operation Watchtower. The Japanese were beginning work on an airfield, the future Henderson Field, on Guadalcanal. Admiral King put his foot down, ordered Watchtower to start within a month, and how right he was. The Japanese expected to have the new Guadalcanal field ready for 60 bombers by 1 August, and by the end of the month to base a whole air flotilla there. That would menace our entire position in the South Pacific. Had we not attacked when we did, a new seaborne invasion of Port Moresby would have started in mid-August. Preparations were so hasty, and the forces available so lean, that the officers concerned nicknamed this Operation Shoestring. And one on a shoestring it was, since the main Allied effort at the time was directed to Operation Torch in North Africa. Vice Admiral Gormley, who remained in Noumea, had overall command. Under him, Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher commanded the expeditionary force, as well as a carrier supporting force built around Enterprise, Saratoga and Wasp. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, the rough, tough but highly intelligent flag officer who helped make the pre-war strategic decision of March 1941, now became Commander South Pacific Amphibious Force. This comprised, on the naval side, 2 Australian heavy cruisers and 1 light cruiser, 4 United States heavy cruisers and 19 destroyers, and for ground forces, about 19,000 Marines under Major General Alexander Vandergrift, embarked in 19 transports. Almost the entire Pacific Fleet at that time was involved. The operation was quickly mounted at Wellington, Sydney, San Diego and Noumea. The Marines rehearsed in the Fijis at the end of July. This meant too short a period for training. Watchtower was the first amphibious operation undertaken by United States forces since 1898, and the feeling among the participants was anything but confident. The Japanese in Malaya, the Philippines and Java had acquired a reputation of invincibility, especially in jungle fighting. Despite their defeat at Midway, they still had plenty of ships and planes to throw into the Solomons. Furthermore, there is something sinister and depressing about that sound, soon to be renamed Iron Bottom, between Guadalcanal and Florida Islands. Men who rounded Cape Esperance in the darkness before dawn of 7 August remember that it gave you the creeps. Even the land smell failed to cheer sailors who had been long at sea. Guadalcanal gave out a rank, heavy stench of mud, slime and jungle. And the serrated cone of Savo Island looked sinister as the crest of a giant dinosaur emerging from the ocean depths. Everything went well, for a time. Surprise, one of the most essential conditions of a successful landing in enemy territory, was complete. The landings on Guadalcanal were effected in full daylight against slight and scattered opposition, and the incomplete airstrip was occupied at 4 p.m., Tulagi, where the bulk of the defence force was located, took more time and effort, but was practically secured by the morning of 8 August. On D-Day, 7 August, there developed the first serious counterattack, a raid of some 43 Japanese bombers with fighter cover from Rabaul in 3 groups, intercepted successfully by Wildcats from Fletcher's 3 carriers, then operating southwest of Guadalcanal. They did no damage this time, but on the 8th, 9 Japanese torpedo bombers bored into the transport area, and 1 burning plane crashed transport George F. Elliot, which had to be abandoned. By midnight, 8 to 9 August, the beachheads and airstrip on Guadalcanal and the 3 wanted islands on the Tulagi side of the Sound were secured. Prospects looked bright indeed. Then, shortly after midnight, there opened the Battle of Savo Island, probably the worst defeat ever inflicted on the United States Navy in a fair fight. Early in the morning of 7 August, news of the American landings reached Vice Admiral Mikawa at Rabaul. His decision was prompt and intelligent, to send reinforcements to the Tulagi Guadalcanal garrison, and to assemble a task group to attack the American ships unloading there. A few hundred troops were hastily assembled at Rabaul and embarked in transport Meio Maru, which was sent off to the endangered island with a light escort. When this transport was steaming about 14 miles off Cape St. George shortly before midnight 8 August, she encountered United States submarine S-38, Lieutenant Commander H.G. Munson, a veteran of the Java campaign, and was torpedoed and sunk. So much for that. Mikawa's naval reaction is a very different story. 1 hour after receiving the bad news from Tulagi, he began collecting from Cavien and Rabaul a task group to attack the American Expeditionary Force. It was a scratch team. The ships had never trained together before, but it proved to be good enough for the task in hand. Heavy cruisers Chokai, flagship, Aoba, Kako, Kinugasa, and Furutaka, light cruisers Tenryu and Yubari, and 1 destroyer, Unagi, made rendezvous in St. George Channel around 7 a.m. August 7 and started hell-bent for Guadalcanal. Mikawa's battle plan, sent by Blinker to each ship, was to enter Iron Bottom Sound in the small hours of the 9th, strike the warships guarding the expeditionary force, shoot up the unloading transports, and retire. An excellent plan, but the chances of detection were great, as the striking force had to steam in full daylight down the slot between the central Solomon Islands before entering the cover of darkness. Owing to a series of blunders on our side, the slot was not properly covered by air search on 8 August, and the one sighting of Mikawa's force that day by an Australian Hudson pilot at 10:26 a.m. was so mishandled by him, as well as by the authorities who passed it along, that Admiral Turner did not receive it until over 8 hours had passed. This contact report, moreover, was misleading, in that the pilot mistook 2 Japanese cruisers for seaplane tenders. On that basis, Turner made the bad guess that the Japanese were not coming through that night, but intended to set up a seaplane base at Santa Isabel Island, some 150 miles from Savo, and attack later. Dogmatically deciding what the enemy would do, instead of considering what he could or might do, was not Turner's only mistake on that fatal night. He allowed his fighting ships to be divided into 3 separate forces to guard 3 possible sea approaches by the enemy. Rear Admiral Norman Scott, with 2 light cruisers and 2 destroyers, patrolled the transport area between Tulagi and Guadalcanal and never got into the battle. The 2 western approaches, on each side of Savo Island, were guarded by 6 heavy cruisers and 4 destroyers, besides 2 more destroyers thrust out as pickets under Rear Admiral Victor Crutchley. This British flag officer in the Australian Navy was a gallant and jovial figure, sporting a full red beard to hide a wound scar. He had taken part in the Battle of Jutland and won the Victoria Cross. For reasons unknown, Crutchley neither conferred with his cruiser captains before the battle, nor issued a battle plan, and his disposition was faulty. The cruisers were divided into 2 groups, the southern under himself in His Majesty's Australian ship Australia, with her sister ship Canberra, USS Chicago, and 2 destroyers, guarded the southern entrance to the Sound. USS Vincennes, Astoria, and Quincy, with 2 destroyers, under the tactical command of Captain Reefcoal in Vincennes, guarded the northern entrance. Turner was so certain that the enemy would not attack that night that he made the further mistake of summoning Crutchley in Australia to a conference on board his flagship Macaulay, some 20 miles away, in Lunga Road's Guadalcanal. This action of Turner's stemmed from the worst of all blunders that night, Admiral Fletcher's decision to retire his three-carrier task force from its covering position, depriving the landing force of air cover next day. He did so on the flimsy ground that his fighter plane strength had been reduced 21% in 2 days' operations, and that his ships needed fuel, of which they were far from dangerously short. Probably the real reason was that Frank Jack had already lost Lexington and Yorktown, and did not intend to lose another carrier. He commenced this withdrawal at about 6:10 p.m. August 8 without consulting Turner, who was below him in the chain of command. That was why Turner felt he had to confer with Crutchley and Vandergrift to decide whether the partly unloaded transports should depart that night or risk more Japanese air attack without air protection. Consequently, Cruiser Australia and the officer in tactical command were not on hand when badly needed, and the depleted cruiser group south of Savo Island was commanded by Captain Bode of Chicago, who acted as if dazed. This was a hot, overcast and oppressive night, heavy with impending doom, as a novelist would say. At 11:15 p.m., when Turner's flag conference opened, the two cruiser groups off Savo Island were steaming at low speed on their monotonous patrol courses. Officers and men were dog-tired after 2 full days of incessant action. They had been at general quarters for 48 hours. At 11:45 p.m. came the first disturbance. 3 unidentified planes reported by picket destroyer Ralph Talbot. Turner did not get this report, but the cruiser captains who did, and who even saw the planes overhead, assumed with incredible optimism that they were friendly. These planes had been catapulted by Mikawa's cruisers at 11:10 p.m. to tell him what to expect and to illuminate targets for his gunners. They droned unmolested over the sleepy American ships for an hour and a half, sending exact information of their movements that was very helpful to the Japanese admiral. At 12:40 a.m. August 9, Admiral Mikawa, having sighted Savo Island in the darkness, summoned his men to battle stations. He was using hooded blinkers, invisible outside his column, to signal his ships. 3 minutes later, lookouts in flagship Chokai sighted a ship, obviously enemy, on their starboard bow. This was picket destroyer Blue. Mikawa wisely decided that this was no moment to alert the enemy by shooting. He ordered a slow down to 22 knots, and the Japanese column padded silently by, every gun trained on Blue, just in case she opened up. Nobody in the destroyer suspected a thing. Her submarine chaser radar did not register, and her lookouts were looking the wrong way. After another tense half-hour, the Japanese sighted ahead 2 American cruisers and 2 destroyers. At 1:36 a.m., Mikawa ordered commence firing. 2 minutes later, a flock of torpedoes leapt out of their tubes, aimed at Chicago, Canberra, and Bagley. For 5 minutes more, the Japanese force approached undetected. Not until 1:43 a.m. did Commander Frank Walker of Destroyer Patterson, the only American ship properly awake that night, sight them. Immediately she broadcast the tocsin. Warning, warning, strange ships entering harbour, too late, too late. 3 Japanese float planes, alerted by Mikawa, now dropped brilliant flares which silhouetted the American southern group, and at that moment the Japanese heavy cruisers opened gunfire. A few seconds later, His Majesty's Australian ship Canberra, with general alarm sounding and her guns still trained in, was hit by 2 of the torpedoes launched at 1:38 a.m. Next, range less than 1 mile, she was literally taken apart by 24 shell hits in less than 1 minute. Her captain and gunnery officer were killed, unquenchable fires spread, and this fine Australian cruiser had to be abandoned and eventually scuttled. Chicago was similarly surprised. Captain Bode, who in Crutchley's absence was officer in tactical command of this group, was awakened out of sound sleep by gunfire, and, with a column of 5 heavy cruisers to shoot at, steamed off in pursuit of Mikawa's lone destroyer, little the worse for 1 shell hit and 1 torpedo explosion well forward. Chicago was out of the battle. Having dealt with these 2 cruisers and their destroyers, Mikawa divided his yet untouched column to put the pincers on the northern group of American cruisers. They had heard Patterson's warning at 1:43 a.m., but no other word. Shut off from the southern group by a heavy rain squall, they could not see what was going on, and Captain Bode in the confusion forgot to signal their officer in tactical command. Vincennes was followed in column by Quincy and Astoria, with destroyers Helm and Wilson on their flanks. All were on the northwesterly leg of their box patrol, when at 1:48 a.m. Chokai launched torpedoes at Astoria, the nearest. Captain Greenman was catching a little sleep after some 40 hours spent on the bridge. His gunnery officer, Lieutenant Commander Truesdell, commenced firing the main battery on his own initiative at 1:52.5 a.m. Chokai's torpedoes missed, but she poured salvo after salvo of 8-inch shell into hapless Astoria, which became a blazing shambles. She went dead in the water and, defying all efforts of her damage control crews, sank next day. Quincy, next astern of Astoria, was the least prepared for action and took the worst beating, but in the opinion of the Japanese, she put up the best fight of any Allied ship that night. A searchlight from Ioba, which brilliantly illuminated her at about 1:50 a.m., found her guns still trained in, fore and aft. Promptly she trained them on the target and got off 2 9-gun salvos, from which 2 shells hit Chokai, one of them demolishing the Japanese admiral's staff chart room. In avoiding collision with Vincennes ahead, she appeared to the enemy to be bearing down on them to ram. Although enveloped in flames from midships aft, a shell burst having lighted a plane on her fantail, her forward guns continued to fire. Now the doomed cruiser was caught by crossfire between the 2 Japanese columns. Turret number 2 exploded after a shell hit. Number 4 fire room took a torpedo. Engine rooms became sealed death traps. The sick bay was wiped out. A shell ignited the ammunition for a 5-inch gun. Fires raged throughout. The only question now was whether she would burn to death or sink. Captain Moore, mortally wounded by a shell hit that killed almost everyone on the bridge, ordered the helmsman to try to beach her on Savo Island. Then he gave up the ghost. The senior surviving officer, 7th in the chain of command, ordered abandon ship. At 2:35 a.m. Quincy rolled over and sank, first piece of the steel carpet that now underlies Iron Bottom Sound. Leading the northern cruiser column, and last to be engaged, was Vincennes. At 1:50 a.m. Captain Reefcoal and his executive officer were still speculating about Patterson's warning and what the sound of distant gunfire and airplane flares meant when Japanese searchlights fastened on their ship. Reefcoal assumed that they were from the southern group, having strayed off its patrol course, and even signalled Chicago by radio to shut off the searchlights. An 8-inch salvo from Kako ended that line of thought. Vincennes replied in kind at 1:53 a.m., and her second salvo made a hit on Kinugasa. Enemy gunfire simultaneously exploded the planes on the American cruiser's fantail, and their flames provided a brilliant illumination which helped the enemy, as he swept by, to destroy Vincennes methodically by gunfire and torpedoes. She took 3 of these in 2 fire rooms, floundered to a halt, and pounded by repeated gunfire, with direct hits on every gun turret, went down into the depths a few minutes after Quincy took the plunge. By this time the Japanese force was in disorder, owing to each ship's manoeuvring to fire at best advantage, and Admiral Mikawa was not certain where they all were. So at 2:20 a.m. he ordered all ships to reform northwest of Savo Island, intending apparently to execute the second part of his battle plan and fall on the almost undefended transports. But Mikawa was uneasy in his mind, as he confessed after the war. At 2:40 a.m. he thought better of returning to the fray and ordered all ships to make for Rabaul at top speed. His reason, strangely enough, was a fear of being bombed in the approaching daylight by planes from Admiral Fletcher's carriers, which by that time were hightailing to safety. Even though Mikawa lacked the strategic savvy to gather more fruits of victory, a resounding victory it was. In a battle lasting exactly 32 minutes, he had sunk or put in a sinking condition 4 heavy cruisers and chased away a 5th, with negligible damage to his own force, and at a cost of only 35 men killed and 57 wounded. An investigation by the United States Navy so evenly distributed the blame that nobody was punished. Military commanders, wrote Churchill, should not be judged by results, but by the quality of their effort, and it was well that Admiral Turner was retained, since he became the leading practitioner of amphibious warfare in the Pacific. Admiral Crutchley, exonerated because not present, retained his position in the Australian Navy, and was even knighted. Captain Reefcoal of Vincennes, who had made about as many mistakes as a commanding officer could make, was broken in spirit by the loss of his ship. He used to go about, like Kipling's Matun the Old Blind Beggar, telling over and over the story to anyone who would listen of how his ship had prevented Mikawa from attacking the transports by wrecking the flag chart room. Quincy did that, and that the battle should be called an American victory. Captain Bode of Chicago, whose stupidity was largely responsible for that cruiser's inglorious part in the battle, committed self-termination. Many lessons were learned from this disastrous battle. Canberra and Astoria might have been saved but for their heavily upholstered wardroom furniture and the layers of paint and linoleum on their bulkheads and decks. All inflammable furniture and bedding was now ordered ashore, and every ship in the Navy was ordered to scrape down her interior to bare steel. Day and night for the rest of 1942, sounds of chipping hammers were never still. Improved firefighting technique and the fog nozzle, far superior to a solid stream of water, were developed. Communications were improved, and officers adopted a more reasonable battle readiness condition which relieved them and their men from continual tension. Thus, Savo Island was neither a decisive battle nor an unprofitable defeat. Although the cost was heavy, 4 heavy cruisers and 1 destroyer sunk, 1,270 officers and men killed and 709 wounded. It opened a bloody and desperate campaign for control of an island that neither side really wanted, but which neither could afford to abandon to the enemy. Guadalcanal is mountainous, covered with dark green rainforest jungle, interspersed with patches of light green kunai grass, whose tall, saw-toothed blades can inflict a nasty wound on walkers. Along the north coast, where the Japanese had built their landing strip, there is a narrow plain where the Australians had planted coconut groves. The fuzzy-haired Melanesians, whose labour converted the ripe nuts into copra, were uniformly hostile to the Japanese, who had pushed them around too violently, and friendly to the Allies. They, as well as the Australian coast watchers who concealed themselves in the Japanese-held Central and Upper Solomons, were an important factor in the eventual Allied victory. The main factor, however, was the Marines. When the transports and surviving naval vessels departed on 9 August, they had landed over 16,000 Marines, but less than half their supplies and weapons had been unloaded. The Leathernecks pulled in their belts and lived on 2 meals a day, using the large stores of rice which the Japanese had obligingly left, but they could not continue to fight without naval support. Witness what had happened at Wake. For the present, they concentrated on setting up a 5-mile-long defence perimeter from the Tenaru, ILU, river to the native village of Kukum, and, by using abandoned Japanese equipment, turning the airstrip, then no more than a piece of level ground, into Henderson Field. It was ready for the first flight of Marine Corps planes on 15 August. On the same day, the Marines received their first reinforcements, aviation gas, ammunition, and a Cub unit to service planes, in 3 fast destroyer transports, and these returned on the 20th with rations. During the 12 days following the Battle of Savo Island, the Japanese lost their best opportunity to reinforce their small garrison and run us off the island. They had full sea and air command. There was nothing to stop them but submarines and marines. But the High Command was more interested in its Papuan operation, and General Hyakutake at Rabaul, estimating that only 3,000 Marines were on the island, thought that 1,000 more Japanese could do the trick. Accordingly, the Ichiki detachment, originally slated to occupy Midway, was loaded in the 6 destroyers of Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka's squadron and landed east of the Marines' perimeter in the night of 18 to 19 August. 2 days later, Colonel Ichiki and his 815 men were completely wiped out by a part of the 1st Marines under Lieutenant Colonel E. A. Pollock, who lost only 34 men killed. This battle of the Tenaru River, a model of perfectly coordinated effort, freed the Marines' eastern flank and had far-reaching effects. The Corps' first stand-up fight with the much-touted jungle-fighting Japanese, it proved that the American was the better fighting man, even on his enemy's chosen terrain. From that time on, United States Marines were invincible. It also proved what a mistake it is to commit forces piecemeal, but the Japanese warlords did not heed this lesson. Not even Yamamoto did. An old Chinese proverb says, "A lion uses all its might in attacking a rabbit." Yamamoto had acted on that principle at Midway, but the rabbit won, and he reverted to the piecemeal doctrine, saving his best capital ships for a future all-out offensive. His biggest commitment came now, in the third week of August. 3 carriers, 3 battleships, 9 cruisers, 13 destroyers, 36 submarines and several auxiliaries to cover a reinforcement of only 1,500 men to the garrison in western Guadalcanal. The reinforcement unit, under Rear Admiral Tanaka, was to run down the slot and land the troops at night. In the meantime, a fleet carrier force under Vice Admiral Kondo, spearheaded by Shokaku and Zuikaku, with 2 battleships and 3 heavy cruisers, advanced into waters northeast of the Solomons to engage whatever ships Admiral Gormley ventured to deploy. Admiral Hara's light carrier Ryujo, thrusting ahead, would play the dual role of flying off bombers to pound Henderson Field, and baiting the American carrier planes into attacking her, while formidable air groups from the 2 big carriers punished Frank Jack Fletcher's flat tops. 6 submarines steamed ahead to scout, 6 others were deployed southwest of the Santa Cruz Islands, and 4 groups of 3 each thrust down to the south and west. It looked like a sure thing. Warned by Australian coast watchers and American reconnaissance planes, Admiral Gormley now ordered Fletcher's strong carrier force, Enterprise, Saratoga, Wasp, north, to cover sea lanes into the Solomons. By daybreak, 23 August, they were east of Malaita and about 150 miles from Henderson Field. Admiral Kondo did not yet know their exact position, and Fletcher, misinformed by Pacific Fleet intelligence that the Japanese force still lay north of Truk, decided at the close of the 23rd that there would be no battle for several days. So he sent the Wasp group to a fueling rendezvous. This was a bad move, for Yamamoto had already ordered Kondo to press ahead and engage him. At 9:05 a.m. August 24, an American PBY spotted carrier Ryujo about 280 miles northwest of Fletcher's now 2-carrier force. At 1:45 a.m., Fletcher took the offensive, launching 38 bombers and torpedo planes to snap at the bait. Within 1 hour, his search planes discovered Shokaku and Zuikaku, some 60 miles farther north than Ryujo. Fletcher attempted to divert his strike to the big carriers, but communications that afternoon were abominable and he could not reach the pilots. Commander N.D. Felt's air group attacked Ryujo successfully, and at 10 p.m. she was swallowed up by the sea. Admiral Nagumo decided that the hour had come to avenge Midway. At 3:07 p.m. and 4 p.m., 2 attack groups rolled off the decks of Zuikaku and Shokaku. Poseidon and Aeolus had arranged a striking setting for this battle. Towering cumulus clouds, constantly rearranged by the 16-knot southeast trade wind in a series of snowy castles and ramparts, blocked off nearly half the depthless dome. The ocean, 2 miles deep at this point, was topped with merry whitecaps dancing to a clear horizon, such as navigators love. The scene, dark shadows turning some ships purple and sun illuminating others in sharp detail, a graceful curl of foam at the bow of each flat top, the long bow of North Carolina, a recent arrival from the Atlantic, Atlanta bristling like a porcupine with anti-aircraft guns, heavy cruisers stolid and businesslike, and the destroyers thrusting, lunging and throwing spray, was one for a great marine artist to depict. To practical carrier seamen, however, the setup was far from perfect. Those handsome clouds could hide 100 vengeful aircraft. That high equatorial sun could provide a concealed path for pouncing dive bombers. That reflected glare of blue, white and gold bothered and even blinded the lookouts and made aircraft identification doubtful. Altogether, it was the kind of weather a flat-top sailor wants the gods to spread over the enemy's task force, not his own. As at Midway and Coral Sea, each carrier group, in a tight circle about 2 miles in diameter, was independent of the other. Enterprise operated 10 miles northwest of Saratoga. Fletcher was ready for Japanese bombers with 51 Wildcats, mostly from Enterprise, stacked in 3 layers as combat air patrol. At 4:29 p.m. August 24, the attack group was only 10 miles away. Dive bombers and torpedo planes helped combat air patrol to intercept it. About 24 dive bombers got through, one diving about every 7 seconds. Enterprise took 3 bombs, which killed 74 men, ruptured her decks and wrecked the 5-inch guns, but good damage control saved the ship. North Carolina also attracted enemy attention, but she drove off or shot down 14 bombers that got through combat air patrol. By 4:47 p.m. this main attack was finished, and Enterprise at 5:49 p.m. headed into the wind to recover planes. But Big E's troubles were not over. Delayed effects of 2 bombs stifled the steering engine and jammed her rudder. By amazingly quick and courageous work, this was brought under control at 6:59 p.m., just when the second Japanese attack wave should have come in, but it missed the carriers altogether. None of the attackers got through to Saratoga, but she hit back at the enemy. 5 Avenger torpedo bomber and 2 Dauntless dive bombers under Lieutenant Harold H. Larson were scrambled to counterattack. At 5:45 p.m. they attacked Kondo's advance force, badly damaging seaplane carrier Chitose, and were back on board Sara by 1930. They had no fighter cover, and they were only 7 on a mission for which tenfold the number of planes would have been assigned later in the war. Gallant lads these, none braver. Admiral Fletcher now decided to call it a day and turned southward toward a fueling rendezvous. His 2 carriers, amazingly, had lost only 17 planes. Kondo sent his van of battleships and cruisers in pursuit, but gave it up and retired before midnight. Neither commander regarded the battle as finished, but to all intents and purposes it was, except for Admiral Tanaka's reinforcement unit. His destroyers pranced up and down off Lunga Point that night, bombarding the Marines' perimeter. Next morning, 25 August, the Marines' own air group from Henderson Field badly damaged Tanaka's flagship Jintsu and a transport, while a B-17 actually sank a destroyer, which caused amazement on both sides. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons was over. It is generally accounted an American victory, though far from clean-cut, since 2 big Japanese carriers remained afloat and undamaged. But the study of this engagement by American airmen and technicians led to great improvements in aircraft tactics and carrier construction in the immense pilot training and shipbuilding programs underway. An unfortunate epilogue was the torpedoing of Saratoga, about 260 miles southeast of Guadalcanal, by submarine Y-26 on 31 August. She was saved, but her repairs took 3 months to complete. Admiral Fletcher, flying his flag in her at the time, was now relieved, and during the rest of the war received commands more commensurate with his abilities. This Guadalcanal campaign ran from one crisis to another. After the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, each side concentrated on reinforcing its island garrison. Admiral Gormley initiated an almost continuous reinforcement by freighters, covered by combatant ships and by planes. The Japanese kept thrusting reinforcements into the island after dark in fast destroyers, covered by naval bombardments which made nightlife hideous for the Marines. Ashore there was fighting every day in the week, and 2 big offensives. The one laid on by the island commander, General Kawaguchi, 12th to 14 September, was known as the Battle of the Bloody Ridge, in which the Japanese lost a cool 1,000 men against 40 dead Marines. This was followed by a westward thrust by the Marines themselves, along and around the Matanikau River on their west flank, which lasted for 2 weeks from 23 September. Apart from these battles, a curious tactical situation developed, a virtual exchange of sea mastery every 12 hours. The Americans ruled the waves from sunup to sundown. Big ships discharged cargoes, little ships dashed through the Sound, landing craft ran errands between Lunga Point and Tulagi. But as the tropical twilight performed a quick fade-out and the pall of night fell on Iron Bottom Sound, big ships cleared out like frightened children running home from a graveyard, and small craft holed up in Tulagi harbour. Then the Japanese took over. The Tokyo Express of troop-laden destroyers and light cruisers dashed in to discharge soldiers or freight where their troops controlled the beach, and departing tossed shells in the Marines' direction. But the rising sun flag never stayed to greet its namesake. By dawn the Japanese were well away, and the stars and stripes reappeared. Such was the pattern cut to fit the requirements of this strange campaign. Any attempt to reshape it meant a bloody battle. The Japanese rarely, and then only disastrously, attempted daytime raids with ships. The Americans more frequently interfered with the Tokyo Express. But any such attempt was apt to be fatal, as was that of destroyer transports Little and Gregory on 5 September. Both were sunk. It was not easy to get American reinforcements to Guadalcanal. To protect a convoy of 6 transports carrying the 7th Marine Regiment, which departed Espiritu Santo on 14 September, Admiral Gormley committed 2 carriers, Wasp and Hornet. Japanese submarines, I-19 and I-15, which had missed their opportunities in the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, now hit the jackpot. The one penetrated Wasp's destroyer screen on 15 September, got 3 torpedoes into her, and sank that big carrier. The other took a crack at Hornet, missed her, but got 1 torpedo each into destroyer O'Brien and the North Carolina. Both survived, though O'Brien sank on her way to the west coast. Admiral Turner, in command of the transport echelon, decided to push on, and never was the old naval adage stout hearts make safe ships better tested. The Marines, 4,000 in number, were safely landed at Guadalcanal on 18 September. Some effort had to be made to break this deadlock. Could not more help be obtained from the Southwest Pacific? A conference to discuss this subject was held at Noumea on 28 September. Admirals Nimitz, Gormley and Turner, General MacArthur's Chief of Staff General Sutherland, and General Hap Arnold, head of the Army Air Force, attended. MacArthur had 55,000 troops, American and Australian, in Port Moresby. The Japanese attempt to take Port Moresby by marching troops across the Owen Stanley Range had been halted on 17 August, and Nimitz thought that MacArthur might now spare troops for Guadalcanal. Sutherland rejected this idea flat. He expected the Japanese to start another Coral Sea operation. Nobody on our side knew that on 31 August the Japanese High Command had decided to throw everything it had into Guadalcanal, and until that island was secured, to leave their Papuan army out on a limb. The 2 admirals at the Noumea conference, even without that knowledge, warned that unless Guadalcanal were reinforced, the enemy could push us off the island whenever he really tried. Try he did, and thrice, but not quite hard enough, as we were trying a little harder. The next naval battle, that of Cape Esperance, was sparked off by the dispatch of a reinforced regiment of the American Division to Guadalcanal, in 2 big transports and 8 destroyer types, on 9 October. Admiral Turner commanded this echelon, and Gormley sent up a cruiser group to run interference. The cruisers were commanded, in San Francisco, by Rear Admiral Norman Scott, a young and brilliant flag officer. He had had 3 weeks to give his task force intensive training in night action, and it paid off well. For a week or more, the Japanese had been running nightly Tokyo expresses to northwestern Guadalcanal, and a particularly strong one was due on the night of 11 to 12 October. 2 seaplane carriers and 6 destroyers carrying troops and a vast amount of ammunition and material commanded by Rear Admiral Joshima. In addition, Rear Admiral Goto brought down the slot a bombardment group of 3 heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers. These were reported by a B-17 to Admiral Scott in the early afternoon of the 11th. He built up speed to intercept them west of Savo Island, launched his cruisers' float planes to track them, and Goto was completely surprised when Scott's cruisers opened gunfire at 11:46 p.m. The American task force, 5 destroyers, heavy cruisers San Francisco and Salt Lake City, and light cruisers Boise and Helena, was just executing a countermarch southwest of Savo Island and north of Cape Esperance, Guadalcanal, from which this battle is named. The range of Aoba at the head of the Japanese column to Helena was only 4,800 yards. So far, so good, but this might have been called the Battle of Mutual Errors. Scott, fearing that his cruisers were firing on Van Destroyer Duncan, ordered ceasefire only 1 minute after firing began. Fortunately, the American cruiser commanders, emulating Nelson at Copenhagen, turned deaf ears to this order, and their gunners continued to pump shells into the enemy ships. Admiral Goto, thinking that Scott's column was Joshima's reinforcement group, then safely within the Sound, did the same, and ordered his column to turn right. A few seconds later, the Admiral was mortally wounded by a shell explosion near his flag bridge. By that time, both Aoba and Furutaka were burning brightly. At 11:51 p.m. Scott discovered his error and ordered resume firing. 4 minutes later, he swung his column northwest to parallel the Japanese. Partly as a result of Goto's bad guess and sudden death, the enemy never returned an effective fire, and lost cruiser Furutaka and destroyer Fubuki to gunfire and torpedo hits. On our side, Duncan was mortally wounded, and Fahrenholt badly so. Boise was badly pounded by 2 enemy cruisers. Her number 1 turret breached and a magazine exploded. But the luck of the Irish and good damage control saved the Galloping Ghost, as the men called Captain Mike Moran's cruiser, to fight another day. The main action was over at 12:20 a.m. October 12th. In the meantime, Admiral Joshima was setting ashore the contents of his reinforcement group. At 2:50 a.m., a float plane from Boise sighted his formation steaming out of the Sound. Bomber planes summoned from Henderson Field sank 2 of his destroyers, which were combing the scene of the action for survivors. Norman Scott fought the Battle of Cape Esperance with cool, determined courage, and despite an intricate countermarch, never let the situation deteriorate into a melee. He became the hero of the South Pacific during the short month that remained of his valiant life. Unfortunately, because it is human to conclude that the result justifies the means, some fallacious conclusions were drawn from the Battle of Cape Esperance, that the single-column formation was all right, and that American gunfire could master any night battle situation. Actually, Scott's disposition was dangerously unwieldy and prevented the destroyers from exploiting their proper weapon, the torpedo. And because the surprised enemy did not get off his usual torpedo attack, that was assumed to be no longer a serious threat. One learns more from defeat than from victory. The Japanese did accomplish their main mission, landing not only troops but heavy artillery while Goto and Scott were fighting. On the other hand, the 164th Infantry Regiment, a Miracle Division, whose journey to Guadalcanal was the reason for Scott's being where he was, landed safely on 13 October, bringing relief to the weary Marines in the perimeter. Tokyo Express for the night of 13 to 14 October was a bombardment mission built around battleships Kongo and Haruna under command of Admiral Kurita. They delivered a 90-minute shoot which killed many Marines, blooded the newly arrived GLs, holed the airfield with yawning chasms, destroyed almost the entire supply of aviation gasoline and 48 aircraft. The bombardment might have lasted even longer, but for the PTs, the first motor torpedo boats to arrive at Tulagi. These piled in against the battleships, shooting and firing torpedoes briskly. And although no hits are recorded, they made Admiral Kurita so nervous, a quality he later showed in greater degree at the Battle off Samar, that he retired at 2:30 a.m. October 14. The following night, of 14 to 15 October, was another bad one for Americans ashore. Admiral Mikawa personally entered Sleepless Lagoon, as the Marines were beginning to call it, in cruiser Chokai, followed by Lucky Kinugasa to churn up the Henderson Field community with 752 8-inch shell and cover the landing of another echelon of troops. Dawn of the 15th revealed a humiliating spectacle. In full view were enemy transports lying to off Tassafaronga, unloading troops and supplies with as much ease as if they had been in Tokyo Bay, and hovering around and over them, destroyers and planes. General Geiger, Marine Air Commander, was told there was no gas at Henderson Field. Then, by God, find some, he roared. Men scoured the dispersal areas, collected some 400 drums of aviation gas from swamps and thickets where they had been cached, and trundled them to the field. Even 2 disabled B-17s had their tanks siphoned dry. By these pint-pot methods, enough fuel was procured to enable planes to make the 10-mile hop to the targets off Tassafaronga and back. Army, Navy and Marine pilots bombed and strafed the transports all day long 15 October, fighting off Zeeks and dodging the darting tongues of anti-aircraft tracers. Flying fortresses flew up from Espiritu Santo and lent a hand. High over the revitalized airfield, Wildcat bullets and anti-aircraft shells brought down 12 bombers and 5 fighters. Everybody who flew claimed damage that day, and for once they were right. 3 large Japanese transports not yet completely unloaded had to be beached and became a total loss. By 3:50 p.m. things had become so hot that the Japanese task force commander decided to retire. Not one transport escaped damage. Not one troop unit landed without casualties and loss of equipment. This field day cost the Americans only 3 dive bombers and 4 fighter planes. That night, all hands ashore breathed easier. Even a downpour of 808-inch shells from cruisers Miyoko and Maya and 305-inch from Tanaka's destroyers failed to quench the spark of hope, kindled by the feeling that the enemy had done his worst. But alas, he had not. On 15 October, Admiral Nimitz expressed his estimate of the situation in 3 sober sentences. It now appears that we are unable to control the sea in the Guadalcanal area. Thus, our supply of the positions will only be done at great expense to us. The situation is not hopeless, but it is certainly critical. The extremity of the American situation in mid-October is illustrated by gallant, if pitiful, efforts to keep the lifeline intact. Twin-engine Douglas Sky Troopers became flying workhorses. Each brought up from Espiritu Santo about enough gas to keep 12 Wildcats aloft for an hour. Submarine Amberjack, fitted to carry 2,000 gallons of gasoline and 10 tons of bombs, did her part. A barge-towing Allied expedition was made up of 2 cargo ships, motor torpedo boat tender Jamestown, fleet tug Vireo, and 2 destroyers, each towing a barge carrying 2,000 barrels of gasoline and 500 quarter-ton bombs. On 15 October, 75 miles from Guadalcanal, these lucrative targets were sighted and reported by a Japanese search plane. The bigger ships hastily returned to Espiritu Santo, but around noon Meredith was sunk by a 27-plane raid from carrier Zuikaku. Mid-October marked the nadir of misery for the American at Guadalcanal. Admiral Nimitz was also confronted with the pressing problem of leadership in the South Pacific. Admiral Gormley, a meticulous, conscientious officer with a long record of achievement, lacked the personal qualities needed to inspire American fighting men in a tough spot. Admiral Nimitz, on 15 October, decided that the critical situation requires a more aggressive commander and named Vice Admiral William F. Halsey. Since May, Bill Halsey had been on the binnacle list with dermatitis, but mid-October found him back to battery. On 18 October, with feelings of astonishment, apprehension and regret, he relieved his old friend Gormley. He brought his own staff, headed by Captain Miles Browning, who had fought under Spruance at Midway. Halsey had already won a reputation for leadership, confidence and aggressiveness. The announcement that he was now Commander-in-Chief South Pacific was received on board ships of that force with cheers and rejoicing. Other positive measures were taken. Admiral King released from Atlantic Fleet a task group powered by new battleship Indiana, which came through the Panama Canal to the South Pacific. A flock of 50 Army fighter planes migrated from the Central to the South Pacific. 24 submarines were ordered thither. 2 squadrons of Army B-17s droned across the equator to join the brood under Rear Admiral Aubrey W. Fitch, now Commander-Air South Pacific at Espiritu Santo. In Washington, Admiral King had his hands full. Our predicament in the Solomons was more than matched by that of the Atlantic Fleet. German submarines during October sank 88 merchant ships of 585,000 when the rising sun was to be planted on Henderson Field by General Maruyama. The combined fleet, impatiently circling north of the Solomons, would then apprehend and annihilate any powerful forces in the Solomons area, as well as any reinforcements. This reversed the classic strategy of first securing sea control, which the Japanese had tried unsuccessfully in the Eastern Solomons battle. Admiral Yamamoto would better have stuck to Mahan, for the Marines and the GIs refused to be softened, and the stout fight they put up for a week, 19 to 26 October, to defend Henderson Field and the consequent postponement of Y-Day, gave Admiral Kincaid time to bring up carrier enterprise and take a decisive part in the sea action. The Japanese Guadalcanal garrison, now augmented by the 4,500 troops landed by recent Tokyo expresses, opened attack 20 October against the Marines' western flank on the Matanikau River. This was followed by an enveloping movement against the central and eastern flanks of the American perimeter. Each was beaten off with heavy loss over a period of 6 days. And in this battle for Henderson Field, the GLS proved that they too could defeat jungle-fighting Japanese, if properly trained and led, as indeed they were. Lieutenant Colonel Timbo of the 164th belongs to the Hall of Fame, with Lieutenant Colonels McKelvey, Chesty Puller, Sam Griffith and General Vandergrift of the Marine Corps. During these ground actions there were several minor actions in Iron Bottom Sound, and at least one Tokyo Express failed to deliver the goods, but these were overshadowed by the carrier-fought Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, now making up. Northeast and east of the Lower Solomons are 2 small groups of islands, the Stewarts and the Santa Cruz. The centre of the United States Navy's position in this forthcoming battle was about 280 miles east of the one and 125 miles north of the other, roughly 160 miles east of the spot where Enterprise was hit in the Battle of the Eastern Solomons 2 months earlier. The Santa Cruz Islands, glorified as the site of Bali High in the musical comedy South Pacific, were so infested with malignant malaria and so rugged in terrain that the Army engineers sent there early in August to build an airfield had to give up and leave. Admiral Yamamoto, who directed the show from Truk, really expected to clean up this time. He had 4 carriers, 5 battleships, 14 cruisers and 44 destroyers to throw in. He knew that Wasp had been sunk and that Saratoga was under repair, but did not know that Big E was back, under fighting Tom Kincaid, with South Dakota in her screen. This new battleship, freshly provided with dozens of the new 40mm anti-aircraft guns, was commanded by one of the Navy's most remarkable characters, Captain Thomas L. Gatch. No ship more eager to fight ever entered the Pacific. For the skipper, by constant target practice on towed planes, ignoring lapses in spit and polish, and exercising a natural gift for leadership, had welded his green crew into a splendid fighting team. "They looked like a lot of wild men," said one of his officers, and they all adored Tom Gatch. Combined fleet was losing its edge, and the ships were running out of fuel, waiting for the Japanese ground forces to take Henderson Field. A premature paean of victory, later retracted from the liaison officer on Guadalcanal, at 1:26 a.m. October 25, sparked off the naval battle. Yamamoto did not know where the American carriers were, but a far-ranging Catalina from Espiritu Santo sighted Nagumo's spoiled children of victory, carriers Shohaku and Zuikaku, at noon. Kincaid acted on this contact by launching a combined search strike from Enterprise that afternoon. But they located nothing, as the Japanese had cagily reversed course, again waiting for certain news of victory ashore. In the small hours of 26 October, Admiral Kincaid, who had been steering northwesterly at 20 knots, began to receive plane contacts on enemy carriers 200 miles away. In the grey hours before dawn, Admiral Halsey on Noumea riffled through the dispatches, glanced at his operations chart, and sent out these words: "Attack, repeat, attack." The sun rose at 5:23 a.m. on a fair day. Low broken cumulus clouds scattered over half the sky, the ocean rising and falling in a gentle swell, a languid 8-knot breeze from the southeast, scarcely raising ripples on the sea's smooth surface. It was weather to the taste of dive bomber pilots who could lurk in the clouds, but to the distaste of anti-aircraft gunners, no cloud has a silver lining for them. Already Enterprise had launched a search mission, each dauntless dive bomber armed with a 500-pound bomb just in case. At 7:40 a.m., 2 bomber pilots sighted light carrier Zuiho, used their bombs, and knocked her out so far as this battle was concerned. 1 hour earlier, a Japanese search plane had sighted Hornet. Admiral Kondo, again Japanese officer in tactical command, ordered strikes to be launched at her immediately from his 3 viable carriers. 20 minutes later, Hornet followed suit. The 2 hostile groups passed one another in the air, each eyeing the enemy and wondering which would find a flight deck on its return. Half Enterprise's group was shot down 10 miles short of its target by a dozen Zeeks which had peeled off especially to get them. Now came the most tense moment for the opposing commanders, Kincaid and Kondo. Each had found the other, each was lashing out at the other. Flagship Enterprise was the hub of a tight little circle rimmed by battleship South Dakota, heavy cruiser Portland, anti-aircraft cruiser San Juan, and 8 destroyers. 10 miles to the southeast cruised Rear Admiral George D. Murray's flagship Hornet, similarly surrounded by floating gun platforms. Stacked in layers overhead were 38 fighters of Combat Air Patrol, all under Enterprise fighter direction. The Japanese strike, first to depart, was also the first to arrive at its target. At 8:59 a.m., the American Combat Air Patrol sighted Val dive bombers at 17,000 feet. At about the same moment, Enterprise entered a local rain squall which concealed her from the approaching enemy, but Hornet was in the clear and the enemy concentrated on her, commencing at 9:10 a.m. Vals dove down, loosing a series of explosive bombs. Hornet and her protectors blackened the sky with shell bursts. One bomb hit the starboard side of the flight deck aft. The Japanese squadron commander, crippled by a shell burst, made a spectacular self-terminatory crash. His plane hit the stack, glanced off and burst through the flight deck, where 2 of its bombs detonated. Even more deadly were the torpedo-carrying Kates, which bored in low from astern, slugging nastily at Hornet's tender groin. 2 torpedoes exploded in the engineering spaces. The carrier, in a thick cloud of smoke and steam, lurched to starboard, slowed to a stop, lost all power and communications. She was now immobile, deaf, dumb, and impotent. 3 more quarter-ton bombs hit the flight deck. She was still writhing from this onslaught when a flaming Kate with a doomed pilot made a hurried run from dead ahead, piled into the port-forward gun gallery, and blew up near the forward elevator shaft. In all, some 27 Japanese planes jumped this carrier, and only 2 got home. But that was a cheap price to pay for depriving the Pacific Fleet of 1/3 of its carrier strength. At 9:25 a.m., when Hornet looked like a bad risk, 52 planes of her air group, led by Lieutenant Commander Gus Widhelm, were approaching the Japanese force. 11 bombers under Lieutenant James E. Vosey fought their way through to the pushover point, drew a bead on Shokaku, and roared down through flak with Zeeks still on their tails. It was worth the risk. 3 to 6 100-pound bombs ripped the Japanese carrier's flight deck to shreds, destroyed the hangar, and ignited severe fires. Shokaku was out of the war for 9 months. Hornet's second wave missed the Japanese carriers, but exploded 2 bombs on cruiser Chikuma and knocked her out for a time. Thus, by 10:30 a.m. October 26, 1 large and 1 small Japanese flat-top had been scratched, and Hornet almost finished. But Zuikaku and Junyo were still intact, and Admiral Kondo had already ordered their planes to go get Big E. His earlier strike would have done so, but for superb ship handling by Captain Hardison and magnificent shooting by the wild men of South Dakota. She, in this action, secured for battle wagons the place of honor that they occupied during the rest of the war, defending carriers from attack. Enterprise took 3 bombs, which killed 44 men, but inflicted no lethal damage on the ship. 40 minutes later, at 11:01 a.m., Jumyo's dive bombers tumbled out of the low overcast. One of them planted a bomb on South Dakota's No. 1 turret. An armor-piercing bomb went right through the thin skin of anti-aircraft cruiser San Juan, exploding below her keel and jamming her rudder. Enemy planes kept dogging Hornet when under tow by cruiser Northampton. She took 3 more hits and had to be abandoned. 2 Japanese destroyers then sank her. Had the later expedient of attaching powerful fleet tugs to each carrier group been in effect, she would have been towed out of enemy range and salvaged. Kondo now shaped a retiring course northward, hoping to renew battle on the 28th, but Kincaid by that time was too far away for him to make contact. The Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands was over. Measured in terms of sinking, the Japanese could claim victory. The loss of the new, powerful Hornet was serious, and left the United States Navy with only 2 carriers in the Pacific, Sara and Big E, both under repair. But Japanese air strength had been reduced by about 100 planes and some of the best pilots. The land battle, which the naval battle was supposed to cover, had failed. Moreover, this Santa Cruz set-to gained precious time for the Americans to prepare for the next expected onslaught. As usual, that was not long a-coming. Admiral Yamamoto, contemptuous of earlier air and ground efforts to capture Henderson Field, now issued a new op plan to secure sea supremacy in the Solomons. Admiral Halsey, exasperated over the loss of Hornet, drafted a plan to thwart him. Between 2 and 10 November, the enemy brought in 65 destroyer loads and 2 cruiser loads of troops to western Guadalcanal. One of these detachments, landed at Coley Point east of the American perimeter, was exterminated by the Marines. Henderson field flyers inflicted major damage on 3 destroyers, helped by the Tulagi PT Squadron. Minesweeper Southard sank 1 submarine. But by 12th November, the Japanese garrison on Guadalcanal outnumbered the Americans for the first time. The big American reinforcements, due to arrive on 11 to 12th November, were 3 combat-loaded freighters escorted by Rear Admiral Scott in anti-aircraft cruiser Atlanta with 4 destroyers, and 4 more transport types, including Admiral Turner's flagship Macaulay, escorted by Rear Admiral Daniel J. Callahan in San Francisco, with 3 more cruisers and 5 destroyers. Since intelligence reports indicated that the Japanese were about to dispatch an exceptionally strong and noxious Tokyo Express, Admiral Halsey deployed 24 submarines in and around Solomon's waters and sent Tom Kinkaid's carrier task force, Enterprise, battleships Washington and South Dakota, 2 cruisers and 8 destroyers, to cover Turner and counter Yamamoto. If Big E, still under repair at Noumea, could not get there in time, the battleships and 4 destroyers would be detached for independent action, under the command of Rear Admiral Willis A. Lee in Washington. That is exactly what happened, and mighty fortunate that it did. Halsey inadvertently afforded Ching Lee his one big moment in the war, even though he later deprived him of an even greater opportunity in the battle for Leyte Gulf. Scott's reinforcement contingent unloaded successfully on 11 November, and Turner's was about half empty at 1:17 p.m. on the 12th, when word came from a coast watcher at Buin that a formidable flock of fighter-escorted bombers was flying down the slot. Their attack on the transports in Lunga Roads an hour later opened the naval battle of Guadalcanal. This first round resulted very ill for enemy aircraft. Admiral Turner, a past master at handling ships in such manner as to thwart air attack and bring all his own anti-aircraft fire to bear, suffered only slight damage, and helped by wildcats from Henderson Field, allowed very few of the 2-engine Bettys to return. Tense calm followed the afternoon's elimination shoot. As Turner steamed back to the unloading area through floating remains of downed planes, he realized that the enemy had just begun to show his hand. Abundant intelligence from search planes and coast watchers indicated that the Tokyo Express that night would include 2 battleships and at least 4 cruisers and 10 destroyers, too much for Callahan's 2 heavy and 3 light cruisers and 8 destroyers to take on with much prospect of success. Yet, with Kinkaid's carrier battleship force too far away to help, there was nothing else to do but for Callaghan to block, and block hard. At dusk, 12th November, Turner pulled out his transports, Callaghan escorting them for a few hours, only before he had to return to face the Japanese onslaught. Uncle Dan Callaghan, austere, deeply religious, a hard-working and conscientious officer who possessed the high personal regard of his fellows and the love of his men, had reached the acme of his career. There was something a little detached about this man, since his thoughts were often not of this world. Something, too, that recalled the chivalrous warriors of other days. One could see him as Ossian's dark-haired Dothmaruno, with beetling-browed Turner in the role of Fingal, exhorting him when they parted that night. "Near us are the foes, Dothmaruno. They come forward like waves in mist. When their foamy tops are seen above the low-sailing vapour, sons of heroes call forth the steel." Callaghan passed through Lunga Channel into Iron Bottom Sound, his ships in single column. 4 destroyers were in the van, then cruisers Atlanta, with Rear Admiral Scott embarked, San Francisco, Portland, Helena, and Juneau. 4 destroyers brought up the rear. This disposition was supposed to be best for navigating restricted waters and for ship-to-ship communication, but it prevented the rear destroyers from making an initial torpedo attack, and for reasons unknown, Callaghan did not place in the van 2 destroyers which had the latest surface search radar, the kind that showed a picture on the screen. Fast approaching was a beefed-up Tokyo Express, 2 battleships, screened by a light cruiser and 14 destroyers, under Vice Admiral Hiroaki Abe. Their mission was to knock out Henderson Field and slaughter the Marines with high-explosive shells. Abe was not looking for a naval battle. He assumed that the Americans, as usual, would be gone with the sun, allowing him to prowl the Sound and bombard at will. It was now Friday the 13th, last day of life for 8 ships and many hundred sailors, including 2 rear admirals. The Americans' first radar contact, at 1:24 a.m., showed Abe's battle wagons almost surrounded by his destroyer screen, approaching from the direction of Savo Island. Callaghan did not alter course to cross the enemy's T. That was his big mistake. At 1:41 a.m. destroyer Cushing, leading the American column, sighted 2 Japanese destroyers about to cross her bows. She turned hard a port to unmask her torpedo batteries and avoid a collision. This maneuver threw the American column into partial disorder, which in a few minutes' time became almost complete. Now surprise was lost, Callaghan delayed 8 minutes before opening gunfire, owing to the confusion engendered by Cushing's turn and his fear of hitting friends. This gave Abe precious time to change his high-caliber bombardment shells for armor-piercing. If one American shell had exploded on his battleships while their decks were heaped with shells, they would have been destroyed. At 1:50 a.m., just as a Japanese destroyer's searchlight picked up the bridge of Atlanta, she began shooting. Other Japanese destroyers and the two battle wagons then deluged the helpless cruiser with shellfire. One snuffed out the lives of Admiral Scott and his staff on the bridge. Atlanta was out of the battle, which now became an unplanned, wild and desperate melee in black darkness, fitfully lighted by gunfire flashes, torpedo explosions and star shell. So far as there was any order in this action, it was Callaghan's cruiser column, minus Atlanta, thrusting between two battleships, Hii to port and Hiroshima to starboard, while destroyers of both sides milled about, shooting at targets of opportunity. Although neither Japanese battleship was hit early in the action, Admiral Abe didn't like it and countermarched. He sank Cushing, which had launched 6 torpedoes fruitlessly at her, and then had a brush with destroyer Laffey, so close that her 14-inch guns could not depress sufficiently to hit the destroyer, whose torpedoes were too close to arm. But Laffey's machine gun fire riddled the battleship's bridge and killed her commanding officer. A Japanese destroyer got a torpedo into Laffey and sank her. Sterrett, next destroyer astern, torpedoed Japanese destroyer Yudichi, and then herself received 3 hits that put her out of the battle. Hie at one time was burning from stem to stern, and she went dead in the water, but Hiroshima took only 1 hit. Admiral Callaghan, informed that his flagship San Francisco was shooting at disabled Atlanta, ordered cease-firing own ships. When that order took effect, his ship was the first to suffer. Hiroshima and 2 other Japanese ships hurled an avalanche of gunfire at her. Admiral Callaghan and almost every member of his staff, and Captain Cassin Young, were killed. Cruiser Portland, Captain Lawrence Dubose, next astern, took a torpedo hit which bent her stern plates so that they acted as a giant fixed rudder. She could only steam in circles. As she sheared out of the column, she let fly at Hie, range 4,000 yards with both forward turrets. Still churning loop-wise, she found crippled destroyer Yudichi at first light and finished her off. That concluded the night's performance for Sweet Pea, as her sailors called this great fighting ship. Helena, next astern, did some useful shooting that helped speed the enemy on his way, but Juneau, the rear cruiser, was put out of action by a torpedo that exploded in her forward fire room. Of the 4 rear destroyers, brand new Barton had exactly 7 minutes of life in combat. 2 torpedo hits broke her in 2, and down she went with most of her crew. Monson was reduced to a burning hulk by some 37 shell hits. Fletcher, the tail-end Charlie with surface search radar, useless in that position, threaded her way through the maelstrom, shooting, and emerged without even her paint being scratched. 4 bells of this sinister mid-watch struck at the height of the battle. An infernal spectacle presented itself to the survivors. Greenish light from flares and star shell dimmed that of the silent stars. Red and white trails of tracer shell arched and crisscrossed overhead. Magazines exploded in blinding bouquets of white flame. Oil-fed fires sent up twisted columns of yellow flame and black smoke. Around the horizon, smouldering hulks of abandoned ships now glowed dull red, now blazed up when fires reached fresh combustibles. Geysers from shells that missed their targets rose from the surface of the sea, now fouled with oil and flotsam. At 2:26 a.m. November 13, Captain Hoover of Helena, the senior undamaged cruiser, ordered all ships that could move to retire via Sealark Channel. Only San Francisco, Juneau, and 3 destroyers were able to comply, and at 11 a.m. submarine I-26 sank Juneau, taking down almost 700 men, including the 5 Sullivan brothers. A bloody postscript, this, to the most desperate sea fight since Flamborough Head, recalling Anglo-Dutch battles of the 17th century, when each side slugged the other until all but one went down. Ship losses were fairly well balanced, 2 American light cruisers and 4 destroyers as against 2 Japanese destroyers, and a battleship so badly damaged that airmen could sink her next day. But the Japanese bombardment mission was completely frustrated. Yamamoto admitted as much by relieving Admiral Abe and depriving him of any further sea command. Callaghan, on the other hand, completed his mission. He had saved Henderson Field from a bombardment which would have been more serious than those of mid-October, and would certainly have stopped the American air operations, which next day disposed of 11 troop-laden transports. Thus, in the end, mistakes were cancelled out by valour. Let none deny praise to those who fell that bloody night, with two great seamen and gallant gentlemen, Daniel J. Callaghan and Norman Scott. Dawn rose on a glassy metallic sea, stippled by the floating litter of death and destruction. The mountains of Guadalcanal turned to purple and then to lush green. Sailors on crippled warships of both nations stood or slept by their remaining guns, grimly aware that between ship and ship no quarter would be given. 8 damaged ships, 5 of them American, were visible between Savo Island and Guadalcanal. Atlanta had edged painfully over to Kukum and landed her survivors, but she was past saving and had to be scuttled. Each side now prepared for another night action. Admiral Kondo, who had been cruising off Ontong Java, pushed south with his yet uncommitted heavy cruisers and destroyers to gather up battleship Hiroshima and cover a Super Tokyo Express commanded by Rear Admiral Tanaka, composed of 11 destroyers escorting 11 troop-laden transports. Admiral Kinkaid's carrier Enterprise and 2 new battleships were boiling up from the south, Big E ringing day and night with hammer blows and the sputter of welders' arcs to repair the forward elevator. Kinkaid decided that the best thing he could do for the cause was to fly off 9 Avengers and 6 Wildcats to beef up General Geiger's air forces on Guadalcanal and to do what good they could en route. They found Hiei limping along north of Savo Island and got 2 torpedoes into her, proceeded to Henderson Field, refueled, picked up some Marine Dauntless dive bombers, and this time made the battleship go dead in the water. B-17s from Espiritu Santo added an egg or two to the collection, and at about 6 p.m. she plunged stern first. Hiei was the first enemy battleship to be sunk by American forces. That night the Americans on Guadalcanal were subjected to heavy bombardment by 2 heavy cruisers which Admiral Mikawa had sent down from Rabaul. As 14 November dawned, airmen, ground crews and stranded sailors rolled out of their foxholes, and Henderson Field warmed up to one of the busiest days in its hectic history. The first strike holed a retiring light cruiser and heavy cruiser Kinugasa, which bombers from the deck of Enterprise then sank. American airmen, both land and carrier-based, now concentrated on Tanaka's transports that were barreling down the slot. In a series of bold attacks, they succeeded in sinking 6 transports with all their supplies, but Tanaka the Tenacious refused to retire. He pressed on to Guadalcanal with 4 destroyers and 4 big transports. These landed their troops before dawn by running onto the beach, whence the ships never got off, but Tanaka and his destroyer escort scampered safely back to Shortlands. 7 more destroyers, which he had detailed to rescue survivors from the sunk transports, picked up almost 5,000 men and carried them to safety. As the 3rd day of this almost continuous naval battle came to an end, orders were given which led to another night action. Kinkaid, as Halsey had planned, detached battleships Washington and South Dakota and 4 destroyers from Enterprise's screen to thrust into Iron Bottom Sound and clean up. Rear Admiral Willis Augustus Lee, officer in tactical command of this group, knew exactly how to handle battleships and had studied how to make the best use of radar. Coming south to meet him was Admiral Kondo in Otago, with the yet undamaged Kirishima, another heavy and 2 light cruisers, and more destroyers under Tanaka, bent on delivering the heavy bombardment on Henderson Field that Abe had been ordered to perform, but Callaghan had prevented. Kondo, whom Commander Hara describes as the British gentleman sort of man, had missed chances in the previous battle, but had been kept in as a favourite of Yamamoto. After this battle, he was out. At 10:15 November 14, Admiral Lee entered Iron Bottom Sound by the Northern Passage. A first quarter moon was shining. Lookouts could pick up looming heights on every side and shore outlines appeared on radar screens, but neither eyes nor radar discerned any trace of enemy. A rich odour like honeysuckle floated out from the land over the calm waters, a pleasant change from the fecal smells usually exuded by the Guadalcanal jungle. This seemed a good omen to the sailors. Lee badly wanted exact intelligence of the enemy. Light cruiser Sendai of Rear Admiral Hashimoto's advance screen had sighted him at 10:10 p.m. The Japanese, with their excellent night binoculars, usually picked us up first. Kondo now adopted a typically Japanese battle plan, splitting his 14-ship task force 4 ways, moving up big units at flank speed while Sendai shadowed Lee. The battle opened at 11:17 p.m. when Lee, steering westerly from Iron Bottom Sound toward its southern entrance, opened fire on Sendai. The Americans missed, and Sendai doubled back to the northward. Next, the destroyers in Lee's van encountered two Japanese destroyers, steaming so close to Savo Island that American radar was useless. The ensuing destroyer duel was disastrous to the Americans. Both Preston and Walker were sunk, and the other two went out of action. Lee pressed on with two battleships only, his men tossing out life rafts to the destroyer sailors as they passed over their ships' graves. Captain Gatch was back on the bridge of South Dakota, but his luck and hers had run out. At the worst possible moment she suffered an electrical power failure, so that she was little help to Lee, except that she absorbed numerous hits which might have crippled his other battleship. Washington, superbly handled by Captain Glenn Davis, picked up Hiroshima on her radar, and at midnight opened up on her at 8,400 yards range. 9 of her 75 16-inch shells and 45-inch shells scored, and within 7 minutes the Japanese battleship, steering gear wrecked and topsides aflame, was out of the battle. Admiral Lee now directed Lone Washington to the northwestward to draw off the enemy cruisers and destroyers that were punishing South Dakota, and succeeded in so doing. At 12:25 a.m. Kondo decided he had had enough and retired. Washington and South Dakota rejoined south of Guadalcanal at 9 a.m. Helpless Hiroshima had already been scuttled. The naval battle of Guadalcanal, which opened on the afternoon of November 12, was over by 1 a.m. on the 15th. This night, battleship action was vastly better fought by the United States Navy than the unorganized brawl of 2 nights earlier. Admiral Lee had a positive doctrine that he maintained, despite the loss of his entire destroyer screen. He made quick, accurate analyses from the information on his radar screen. Washington, conned by Captain Glenn Davis and directed by Admiral Lee with a skill and imperturbability worthy of her eponym, saved the day for the United States. The conclusion of this great battle marked a definite shift for America from defensive to offensive, and for Japan one in the opposite direction. Fortune now for the first time smiled on the Allies everywhere, not only here but in North Africa, at Stalingrad and in Papua. President Roosevelt, while mourning the loss of his friend Dan Callaghan, announced, "It would seem that the turning point in this war has at last been reached." Churchill chose this moment to proclaim the end of the beginning. And a captured Japanese document admitted, "It must be said that the success or failure in recapturing Guadalcanal Island, and the vital naval battle related to it, is the fork in the road which leads to victory for them or for us." From 15 November 1942 until 15 August 1945, the war followed the right fork. It was rough, tough, and uncharted, but it led to Tokyo. After losing the naval battle of Guadalcanal in November, the Japanese Navy proposed to abandon the island. Tojo, having switched his major South Pacific objective from New Guinea to the Solomons, refused to change back. So the struggle continued. Captain Morton L. Deo of Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet Staff wrote a trenchant memorandum to Admiral Nimitz on 10 October, commenting on the defeat at Savo Island and the far from satisfactory events that followed. He declared that unrealistic training of our destroyers and cruisers and the almost exclusive employment of them in escort of convoy had prevented the development of a tough offensive spirit. He suggested the formation of a cruiser-destroyer group in the South Pacific, to be given a solid month of training, especially night fighting, and then thrown up the slot to break up the Tokyo expresses. Belatedly, Admiral Halsey did just that, about a week after the naval battle of Guadalcanal. He appointed Rear Admiral Kincaid commander of a new striking force, composed of heavy cruisers, Minneapolis, Pensacola, New Orleans and Northampton, light cruiser Honolulu, and 4 to 6 destroyers, based at Second Channel, Espiritu Santo. Kincaid took command 24 November, before the task force had all been collected, worked up an operation plan, conferred with the officers, and then was detached by Admiral Nimitz. Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet wanted Kincaid to command the North Pacific Force based on Dutch Harbour, where Fuzzy Theobald was making a mess of things. As commander of the striking force, Kincaid was relieved by Rear Admiral Carlton H. Wright, to whose unhappy lot it fell on the second day of his command, to lead his yet untrained task force against a Tokyo Express led by the redoubtable Tanaka. This Japanese reinforcement plan was comparatively modest. Tanaka's force, consisting of destroyers only, would dash into Iron Bottom Sound and off Tassafaronga, would jettison rubber-wrapped drums of provisions, shove troops overboard to be recovered by small craft operating from the shore, and quickly retire. On this particular night, Tanaka had 6 destroyers crammed with troops and supplies, and 2 more not so encumbered. At 10:25 p.m. November 30, before arriving off Tassafaronga, he encountered Admiral Wright's much stronger task force. The ensuing battle reflected slight credit on the United States Navy, but great luster on the Imperial Navy of Japan. The surface of Iron Bottom Sound that calm night was like a black mirror, and the American float planes detailed to illuminate Tokyo Express were unable to rise from the water. But Wright had the advantage of radar, and destroyer Fletcher in his van had the latest kind. At 11:16 p.m. she picked up Tanaka's force, broad on the port bow, steaming slowly along the Guadalcanal shore toward the dumping-off place. The squadron commander in Fletcher asked permission for his 4 van destroyers to fire torpedoes. Wright hesitated for 4 minutes before granting it, and so lost the battle. For, by the time the torpedoes were launched, about 11:21 p.m., the Japanese column had passed the Americans on a contrary course, and the range was too great for American torpedoes to overtake them. Immediately after his last torpedo smacked the water, Wright ordered cruisers to open gunfire, and the flashes of his guns sparked off Tanaka's reaction. Despite initial handicaps of surprise, cluttered decks and enemy gunfire, Tanaka's disciplined crews in the first moments of battle managed to launch more than 20 fast-running torpedoes, and a large share of the American gunfire concentrated on one Japanese destroyer, Takanami, the only enemy ship sunk in this battle. Not one American torpedo found its target, but at 11:27 p.m. the Japanese long lances began to rip the bowels of Wright's cruisers. Minneapolis took 2 violent explosions and was out of the fight. New Orleans, maneuvering to avoid her, ran smack into another torpedo that sliced off her bow and everything up to No. 2 turret. Pensacola, turning to port to avoid her 2 burning sisters, became silhouetted by them for the enemy's benefit and took a torpedo hit directly below her mainmast, which became a torch blazing with oil from a ruptured fuel tank. Honolulu escaped by smart seamanship on the part of the officer of the deck, Lieutenant Commander George F. Davis. Northampton, after firing 18 salvos from her 8-inch battery, took 2 torpedo hits and sank after more than 3 hours' frantic efforts by damage control to save her. By 1:30 a.m. December 1, all Japanese ships except sinking Takanami were hightailing out of Iron Bottom Sound, undamaged. The 3 stricken heavy cruisers, saved by remarkable energy and ingenuity of their crews, were sent to major bases for repairs, and joined the fleet again by next fall. But it is painfully true that the Battle of Tassafaronga was a sharp defeat, inflicted on an alerted and superior cruiser force by a surprised and inferior destroyer force, whose decks were cluttered with freight. Tanaka was prevented from delivering the goods, and that was held against him by the higher command. By 3 December, this remarkable flag officer was ready for another reinforcement dash into the Sound. General Imamura, who had succeeded to the top army command at Rabaul, now had some 60,000 troops and planned to get 2 divisions of them into Guadalcanal. Successful runs were made on the nights of 3 and 4, 7 and 8, and 11 to 12 December, hampered but not defeated by PT boats based at Tulagi. PT-59, Lieutenant John M. Searles, sank a 2,000-ton blockade-running submarine I-3 on the 9th, and 3 PTs, commanded by Lieutenant Lester H. Gamble, sank Tanaka's newest flagship, destroyer Teruski, on the 12th. Japan had good reason to be proud of her destroyers, and their success was well earned. For 40 years the Imperial Navy had put much thought and great effort into improved torpedoes, night fighting, and torpedo tactics. The 2,300-ton Fubuki-class destroyer, such as those of Tanaka's squadron, were equipped with 9 torpedo tubes fitted for the deadly long lances. The crews were trained to reload them in a matter of minutes, and the commanding officers were all torpedo experts. American and British destroyers enjoyed no comparable material, technique, or training. Nevertheless, faulty tactics and stupid strategy doomed to failure Japan's effort to hold Guadalcanal. During the last weeks of November and the 1st of December, Allied forces on the island were both relieved and increased. The 1st Marine Division, which had fought almost incessantly for 17 seven-day weeks, was relieved by 2 regiments of the 2nd Marine Division. The balance of the American Division came up, and its commander, Major General Alexander M. Patch, relieved General Vandergrift on 9 December. During the rest of December, the Japanese refrained from sending anything but submarines to relieve their now starving Guadalcanal garrison. But they were building a new launching platform at Munda in the Central Solomons for more and shorter air thrusts against Guadalcanal. It was constructed, very cannily, in a large coconut plantation, the trees being kept standing until the last minute. By 5 December, a 2,000-foot runway was ready. Since air bombing did not seem to stop the Japanese beavers, Halsey ordered bombardment missions on Munda by light cruisers and destroyers, beginning on the night of 4 January 1943. On that very day, Tojo decided to evacuate Guadalcanal, but this decision was imparted only to the top Japanese commanders and remained unknown to Allied forces until the operation was completed. A Tokyo Express run on the night of 10 and 11 January 1943 cost us 2 PT boats and the Japanese a destroyer. On the night of 14 to 15 January, Rear Admiral Koyanagi, Tanaka's relief, led down the Slot 9 destroyers, with a rear guard to cover the Japanese evacuation, and delivered it. By 23 January, aerial reconnaissance had reported a large number of transports, freighters and destroyers at Rabaul and Buin, and carriers and battleships milling around Ontong Java, north of Guadalcanal. These were preparations for the final evacuation, but Admiral Halsey, assuming that they meant another major attempt at reinforcement, sent up 4 loaded transports powerfully covered and escorted in the hope to tempting Yamamoto to another naval battle. Commander-in-Chief Combined Fleet declined the gambit, but, with the new Munda airfield as base, he laid on 2 successful bombing attacks which cost us the only heavy cruiser which had survived the Battle of Savo Island. Rear Admiral Robert C. Giffen's covering group for the reinforcement echelon comprised heavy cruisers, Wichita, Chicago, and Louisville, 3 light cruisers, 8 destroyers, and 2 of the Sangamon-class escort carriers, which had demonstrated their worth off Casablanca. Ike Giffen, a tough, colourful officer, had had slight experience in dealing with enemy aircraft. Thus, when Japanese torpedo bombers jumped his task force in the twilight of 29 January, he was in a bad formation to meet air attack. His ships had no orders what to do, and worst of all, he had left his escort carriers behind in order to meet an unimportant rendezvous, so had no air cover. He plugged doggedly ahead, trusting to anti-aircraft fire alone, while the Japanese aviators pressed their attacks repeatedly. At 19:45, Chicago was hit and went dead in the water. Giffen then countermarched. Louisville Captain C. Turner Joy took the stricken cruiser in tow, and escorted by 6 destroyers, headed south at slow speed. At 4 p.m. January 30, the Japanese caught up with them. Crippled Chicago now had air cover from Enterprise, which Admiral Halsey had ordered up. But the combat air patrol provided by Big E was not strong enough to protect an almost stationary target. At a point a few miles east of Rennell Island, 9 torpedo-toting Bettys ganged up on Chicago and put 4 fish into her already damaged starboard side. She sank in 20 minutes. This Battle of Rennell Island was the last of 7 naval battles of the Guadalcanal campaign. The American transports unloaded troops and materiel at Lunga Point without molestation, as did a second convoy of 5 transports which arrived 4 February 1943. By that time, the Japanese were almost out of Guadalcanal. They had chosen the night of 1 to 2 February to begin the final evacuation, which had been going on in driblets for 2 or 3 weeks. American aircraft and destroyers and PTs were dispatched, and a minefield was laid to stop these ships, which Admiral Halsey and General Patch still believed to be bringing troops in, not taking them out. 2 more echelons, on the nights of 4 to 5 and 5 to 6 February, completed the job of removing over 11,000 men. American ground forces never realized what had happened until 9 February, when they covered the entire western end of the island without finding one living Japanese. That afternoon, General Patch radioed to Admiral Halsey. Total and complete defeat of Japanese forces on Guadalcanal effected today. Tokyo Express no longer has terminus on Guadalcanal, so now 2,500 square miles of miasmic plain and savage jungle-covered mountains were in American hands after 6 months of toil and suffering. The American ground force losses were not great. The Japanese lost far more heavily. The number of sailors lost on each side in the sea battles, the aviators lost over the Slot, the Sound and Henderson Field, have never been computed. Exactly 24 combatant ships, exclusive of PTs, patrol craft, auxiliaries and transports, were lost by each side. Tactically, Guadalcanal was a profitable lesson book for the United States Navy, Army and Marine Corps. Strategically, it stopped the enemy in his many-taloned reach for the Antipodes and concluded task number 1 of Operation Watchtower, an arduous climb to Rabaul. Guadalcanal should ever remain a proud name in American military history, recalling desperate fights in the air, furious night naval battles, frantic work at supply or construction, savage fighting in a sodden jungle, nights broken by screaming bombs and the explosion of naval shells. Hail to all who fell, the jagged cone of Savo Island, forever brooding over the once blood-thickened waters of Iron Bottom Sound, stands as a perpetual monument to the men and ships who here rolled back the enemy tide. In the Pacific, the British too were at war with Japan, but they could contribute only to land operations in Burma and India, leaving the naval warfare to the United States. In the European theatre, however, England was the senior partner. She had been fighting Germany and Italy since 1939 to 1940, most of the time alone. She had taken a terrific beating without flinching, and knew the weight of German might. This naturally gave her a great advantage in strategic discussions. Whilst China remained the great enigma in the Pacific, in the European theatre it was Soviet Russia. She had been fighting Germany from the summer of 1941, when Hitler decided to strike her down before resuming his blitz on England. When America entered the war, only the British in North Africa and the Russians were actually engaging the German army. It was therefore a prime necessity for the Western Allies to keep Russia fighting until they were ready to establish a second front in the West. To get help to Russia, Britain and the United States at great sacrifice maintained convoys to Murmansk and Archangel. These were a Royal Navy responsibility, but about half the merchant ships and an even greater proportion of the cargoes were American. Convoy PQ-17, the worst damaged, lost 22 out of 33 ships to U-boats and Norway-based German dive bombers in July 1942. Freighters charged with Lend-Lease goods for Russia were also being sent around the Cape of Good Hope to ports on the Persian Gulf, and other cargoes in Soviet-flagged ships, cautiously let alone by the Japanese, were crossing the Pacific to Vladivostok. But Russia, demanding more, had mobilized left-wing opinions in England and the United States behind the cry, "A second front now." The British Chiefs of Staff and Winston Churchill set their faces firmly against any premature invasion of the continent, and with good reason. Thrice in this war, from Norway, Greece and Dunkirk, they had been thrown out of the continent. Next time they went in, they wished to be certain to stay. England, by early 1942, had mobilized almost her entire manpower, which added up to a small army but a first-rate navy. So why not use the navy to carry commandos on distant, peripheral operations until such time as the Allies had the requisite men and weapons for a massive invasion of the continent? Churchill called this strategy tightening the ring. England's tradition was behind it. She had got at Napoleon by the back door of Spain, and Churchill always believed that his Gallipoli strategy, if implemented by proper amphibious tactics, could have defeated Germany in World War I. That was the only major war since Marlborough's time when England had gone into the continent in a big way, and it had led to useless losses which all responsible Englishmen were determined not to repeat.